In 1957, the world has stopped to listen. Somewhere above, something is speaking. The airwaves are flooded with a persistent beep. Most have no idea what it looks like, let alone what it's capable of. Rumors spread and fears circulate. There are questions that will take decades to answer. But most know only one thing. It was sent by the Soviet Union. This is the story of Earth's first artificial satellite. This is the story of the genius design of Sputnik and the tragic engineer who built it. World War II is over. The explosive birth of the atomic age has sparked growing tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union. Divided between political and economic ideology, negotiations start, stop, stall, and deadlock. The superpowers are on the brink of nuclear war, but the International Council for Science decides to set out a bold vision for the decade. The International Polar Year first began in the late 1800s. It was a year-long international scientific exchange to study the Earth's poles. The next one had run 50 years later. However, that had fallen between two world wars that had yielded a vast crop of new scientific instruments. Rockets once aimed at cities could now be turned to the atmosphere, a broad scientific experiment to study the Earth itself, and hopefully promote and foster mutual trust. It was the time for satellites. The project was renamed the International Geophysical Year, IGY. Altogether, it would represent tens of thousands of scientists and dozens of countries, a truly global exchange and effort. It would run for 18 months, from July 1st, 1957 to December 31st, 1958. The greatest scientific research program ever undertaken, but it was off to a rocky start. In the middle of the Cold War, the IGY was a rare opportunity for international unity. But for the Soviet Union and the United States, it became a race. It required little imagination to move from launching satellites to transporting nuclear missiles around the globe. In the Soviet Union, the satellite effort was spearheaded by a group at the Special Design Bureau, OKB-1. It was headed by figures only known by their titles: Chief Designer of Rocket Space, Chief Designer of Rocket Engines, Chief Theoretician of Cosmonautics. It would be decades until their identities were known. This was intentional. The country's ideology rejected attributing efforts of a group to single individuals. It also served practical security purposes. Many feared that if their identities were public, they could be assassinated by the CIA. Even cosmonauts working under him often didn't know the last name of their chief designer, a man who, despite his loyalty and engineering brilliance, had spent much of World War II in prison. Sergei Pavlovich Korolev had been caught up in the wake of Stalin's Great Purge. He had been arrested, beaten, and forced into a false confession of treason and sabotage. From there, he was shuffled between prison and Kolyma, a notorious Siberian gulag. He was then transferred to Shiriska, a labor camp for scientists with improved living conditions. The transfer saved his life. In a short time, severe mistreatment and malnutrition by the communist regime had taken their toll. He had lost all of his teeth, his jaw had been broken, and had suffered a heart attack. Injuries that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Near the end of the war, he was released. The ordeal had not dampened his loyalty or passion for work, so he was drawn into the post-war development of satellites. But across the ocean, the United States announced plans to do the same, a launch of a satellite for the IGY. There was a sense of immediate urgency. If the Soviets could still beat them to space, it would secure their supremacy in the race, so the government agreed. However, the relatively cheap scientific endeavor was not a priority for a government investigating ICBMs. Immediately, Korolev and his team ran into a problem. The ambitious satellite they had been planning, codenamed Object D, was enormous. 700 pounds of scientific equipment. It was an entire scientific laboratory, built to study the Earth's ionosphere, magnetic field, the sun, and even cosmic rays. The project fell behind schedule. Too many unknowns and too little precedent for the satellite's pressurized shell or communication with the instruments on board. The launch window slipped, from 1957 to 1958, well into the IGY and past the ever-looming American launch. And then it got even worse. News came from the United States of a launch out of Cape Canaveral, a missile launch had been mistakenly reported as a failed launch of an American satellite. Time was closing in. The R-7 engines chosen for their launch were not living up to the heavy Object D. They were falling behind. When I was in high school, I remember listening to stories about space on my headphones when I worked at a summer job. It was slow work. I had to package jewelry. Someone cut out small pieces from metal sheets, bent them, placed 2 of them on a sleeve, and then they were packaged by me. But my boss thought this was inefficient. Hours spent by workers bending little pieces of metal. So he gave me a task. What if we could make a mold? We could press the jewelry into a shape with only a lever. So he let me play around with a 3D printer and learn to model. I made the presses. They failed. And it would take hours for the next print to come again. But that printer is the reason I learned to model. It's the reason this YouTube channel even exists. But a lot of things have changed in the world of 3D printing since. I'm in an office where we have now 2 P2Ss running 24/7, printing parts for warehouse robots in the Netherlands. The machine I had back then was a nightmare compared to what Bamboo Lab is making today. The P2S just works. And it works cheaply and extremely fast. No leveling, and I'm guessing, no babysitting. If a worse machine got me here, I'm genuinely curious what kids messing around with this today are going to build. Link in the description. Each new report sent a new wave of anxiety through Korolev and his team. He had no way to know that the United States' own program was being stalled, plagued by its own political obstacles. The IGY would begin within months, and they were no closer to a satellite. But at the end of 1956, Mikhail Tikhnoravin, Korolev's personal friend and the chief designer of the satellite's rocket, made a suggestion.
What will make satellite little lighter? 30 kilograms or so, or even lighter?
After some hesitance, Korolev agreed. Object D was shelved. Work began on the new, quote, simple satellite, under lead designer Mikhail Kobanov and his deputy Oleg Ivanovsky. The term for satellite in Russian roughly translates to the traveling companion of the world. The long phrase Sputnik-1 was shortened. The satellite itself didn't have a unique name. Instead, the new craft went by the name Prostechki Sputnik, PS-1, or Simple Satellite. Eventually, it was shortened again to just Sputnik-1. The outer metallic heat shields were made up of 2 hemispheres of an aluminum alloy, each 2 millimeters thick. The hemispheres were sealed together by 36 bolts and resin O-rings, 58 centimeters in diameter. It was about the size of a large beach ball, but weighed 83.6 kilograms. The hollow carapace would protect the equipment mounted within. 3 silver zinc batteries made up more than half the mass of the craft. 51 kilograms. The batteries powered a D200 radio transmitter. The transmitter operated at 20 and 40 megahertz. By alternating between each frequency, it produced a distinctive beep-beep. The signal was then passed along to the top hemisphere of the craft. The thermal protective shield was 1 millimeter thick, and attachments held 4 antennas in place. 2 sets of antennas, one for each frequency. One 2.4 meters long, and the other 2.9 meters. The spherical shape had won out over the original design. The senior designers had preferred a conical shape. They argued it would fit better in the nose of the launch vehicle. However, spherically, it could more evenly reflect heat from the sun. This would be important to help keep the radio equipment shielded from overheating. Solar radiation and heat resistance was expected to cook the small metallic instrument. Inside, a remote switch to control the thermal and barometric switches sat beneath the transmitter. If the temperature rose or fell too far, the cooling fan would automatically be triggered to circulate the enclosed nitrogen in zero gravity. Finally, it was sealed and pressurized to 1.3 atmospheres. Object D had been plagued by unreliable subcontractors, so the team was devoted to keeping the development in-house. They only relied on 2 outside organizations, one for the onboard batteries and the other for the radio transmitter. It was an austere, pristinely polished spherical body, reminiscent of natural celestial bodies, the symbol of a new era. But simply put, it was a radio with very thin heat shields. Korolev had an all-consuming passion for his work. Quick to anger and prone to shouting, during construction he kept Sputnik-1 spotless. It was elevated on a special stand and draped in velvet. It was more than just patriotic pride. Once launched, he knew a reflective surface would make it easier for observers to spot. The launch was scheduled for the summer of 1957, as early as May. The window would allow them to beat the slow-moving Americans into orbit. However, there was still one last problem: the rocket. R-7 rockets had been repurposed from ICBMs, but the new rockets had yet to achieve a successful test launch. The launches were scheduled from Baikonur Kosmodrome, but the desert steppe was a rough place to work. The surrounding areas were barren with little natural water. Temperature ranged from -40 degrees Fahrenheit in the winter to 113 degrees in the summer. Bored workers would sometimes catch scorpions in jars just to watch them fight to the death. The maiden flight of the R-7 came in May. It was a short flight. At liftoff, a fire broke out. It engulfed one of the boosters. The rockets crashed back to Earth less than a minute and a half later. A volatile cocktail. Almost 30 meters tall, it ran on kerosene and liquid oxygen. June was no better. Launch after launch was aborted while the Americans kept building. The new rocket was permanently grounded as the entire area was flooded by a tropical rainstorm. It never even made it off the ground. The launch of the next rocket in July was shorter than the first. A euphoric successful liftoff was shattered as the vehicle began to roll. High speeds ripped off the 4 strap-on boosters. It broke up in 32 seconds. Its debris scattered only a few kilometers downrange. One after another, each launch failed. The hot summer of 1957 crawled forward. Korolev's health suffered. As months passed, his dream for a pre-IGY launch were dashed. Each failure threatened not only Korolev's dream of satellites, but his very position in Russian society. The charges which had sent him to the labor camps had only been cleared in the spring. The team worked at breakneck pace. They lived in the shadow of every radio report or paper which might indicate an American launch. Then August came. The 4th launch began. The rocket ignited and flew. It reached its target above Kamchatka Peninsula, 6,500 kilometers away. The team raced to capitalize on the success. A launch was scheduled for October, first for the 6th, but ever anxious of an American launch, pushed forward 2 days. By October 2nd, Sputnik was installed into its R-7 rocket. It was enclosed within the metal nose cone. The rocket was rolled to the launch pad, escorted by Korolev and members of the government. Fueling began bright and early on the 3rd. By the night of the launch pad was awash in enormous floodlights. At 10:28 p.m., the R-7 ignited its engines. The vehicle disappeared under a haze of smoke and bright light, as the engine shook the ground with 398 tons of thrust. It climbed fast, 17,400 miles per hour. The launch was rocky. Delays in the firing of engines and higher than expected kerosene consumption almost aborted the launch. Back on the ground, the team was blind. They waited anxiously to hear from the receiving station. The R-7 hadn't exploded. They could see that. But even if the rocket made it to orbit, what guarantee was there that the satellite had survived? With its orbit, it would be a little over an hour and a half until they knew anything. Korolev waited in the command bunker with senior members of the State Commission. Nearby, a crowd had formed around the van set up next to the launch pad. Inside, engineers waited for confirmation. 96 minutes and 17 seconds later, they had their answer. The Baikonur's loudspeakers blared to life. Everyone could now hear the steady beeping, like a heartbeat from a distant metallic creature. To enable continuous transmission, a Sputnik sent out a signal every 0.3 of a second, then alternating, where a pause in one signal was taken up and transmitted on the other frequency. Sputnik-1 had been launched. It was now free-falling into an elliptical trajectory. The long antennas that had been folded back into the rocket during launch were released. A special spring mechanism shot the legs out, deploying them to 35 degrees relative to its body. It raced along almost 29,000 kilometers per hour. It was nearly parallel with the surface of the Earth, 288 kilometers below. On board, as the sensor detected separation from the rocket, the remote switch triggered the batteries. Energy flooded the 1-watt radio transmitter and onboard thermal control system, and Sputnik woke up. Sputnik's elliptical orbit was wide, 215 kilometers at its closest point, 939 kilometers at its furthest, and almost 80 kilometers lower than planned. It flew with an inclination to Earth's equatorial plane of 65 degrees. The satellite was slowly losing altitude, but it was stable. The team waited. It was only once it passed over a second time that they telephoned the leader of the Soviet Union, Nikita Khrushchev. However, Khrushchev was subdued about the news, chalking it up to another launch. They had plenty of launches, although, a successful one, was nice. He congratulated the team and went to bed. It was impossible for anyone to fully grasp what was about to happen. In a single instance, a new era had begun, the space age, and the world wasn't ready. By the morning, the radio announced the shiny new Soviet moon. By then, it had already traveled over a blissfully unaware United States, unnoticed, twice. Sputnik-1 sped around the planet, almost once every hour and a half. It was the evening of October 4th before President Eisenhower received the news on his farm in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Initial reactions abroad were positive. The scientific community was quick to congratulate the Soviets on their successful, albeit surprising, launch. Amateur ham radio operators openly congratulated their Soviet counterparts over unapproved international channels. It wasn't long before sentiment began to shift. By Monday, awe was replaced by anger and fear. Headlines read "Red Moon" over the US. All around, the Cold War had rumbled on, electrifying the air and coloring every achievement. It had now been less than 2 months since the Soviets had test-fired the first ICBMs. The intended psychological effect was in full effect. In America, it was seen as akin to Pearl Harbor, albeit with the threat only implied. President Eisenhower and his Soviet counterpart Khrushchev were both caught unprepared for the strength of the reaction. Soon, Khrushchev's tune changed. He exalted Sputnik as a masterful act of Soviet science and technological supremacy. However, Eisenhower assured the American public he wasn't worried one iota. America's own satellites were set to launch soon. Behind closed doors, Eisenhower was secretly pleased. He believed the Soviets had done them a good turn. Unintentionally, they had established a new precedent, a precedent that allowed for orbiting satellites to travel over nations, a precedent America would need to launch their own secret spy satellites. Unaware, the general public, however, wasn't comforted. Sputnik traveled the sky for the first 2 months, with its own companion, the shell of its enormous 30-meter, 280-ton R-7 rocket. Together, an alien sight in the sky. As Korolev intended, Sputnik's polished shell was easily visible, even with just the naked eye. It was best seen at sunrise and sunset, when the sun best reflected off of it. But even more conspicuous was the persistent beeping that filled the airwaves, equally thrilling and terrifying, picked up by both radio amateurs and professional stations. It was the first shout from space. The effect was ominous and unnatural. The mysterious signal sent agencies across the United States scrambling to decode the transmission. A message in the sky above American cities, speaking in a language they didn't understand. A Soviet delegate in Washington had to eventually reveal the secret. There was no secret encoded message. The radio signal was just being used to track the craft. It took advantage of radio Doppler, where the pitch of the transmission changed as it passed. It took the Soviet Union 5 days to circulate the first real photo of Sputnik-1. The shiny craft was propped up on a stand, its long antennas trailing behind it. By October 13th, Sputnik and its trailing rocket flew over Manhattan. Stationed in Central Park, NBC captured footage of it overhead. Within hours, it had made its debut on network television. It was now impossible to ignore. Despite its inception as the simple satellite, Sputnik-1 provided scientists with priceless data. Its successful orbit supported theories in rocket propulsion and orbital mechanics. The survival of its internal instruments proved their principles of pressurization sound. The simple beeping showed radio communication was possible. Up to this point, communication through the upper layers of the ionosphere had not yet been proven. Scientists were even able to gather information from how the satellite fell. Falling from its original orbit, Sputnik provided data on how atmospheric density changed at different altitudes. Weeks flew by. While tensions grew, Sputnik was destined for a short life. The onboard batteries had been designed to only last about 2 weeks. They outlasted expectations, but 22 days later, the signal was dead. By November, the death watch had begun. For 70 days, each orbit brought it closer to Earth with a quicker and quicker orbit. The satellite was slowly being pulled back to its home planet. It flew through a denser and denser atmosphere. The shell began to glow with incandescent heat. Only 3 months after its launch, on January 4th, 1958, Sputnik was gone. It didn't crash. The satellite burned up, destroyed on re-entry into Earth's atmosphere, after 1,440 revolutions and 92 days in space. Its life had begun in the bright flash of rockets, and it died in silence. it became a bright man-made shooting star, melting and then burning up in the air. Despite being the last-minute replacement for a more ambitious satellite, it was still 8 times heavier than anything the United States had been designing. Sputnik proved the Soviets had powerful rockets, capable of flying high and flying fast. America's enemies were not so far away after all. By the beginning of 1960, the R-7 was put into service, equipped with nuclear warheads. By the summer, the United States Congress passed the Space Act. Almost exactly a year after Sputnik-1's launch, NASA opened its doors for civilian space efforts. By the end of December, the International Geophysical Year ended. It had been a rousing success, ushering in a new age of space and technological innovation. The stage was set. The 1960s space race kicked into gear. Korolev had helped lift the Soviet Union further and further. Sputnik-1 was quickly followed by Sputnik-2 and its K-9 cosmonaut Laika. Object D finally took flight as Sputnik-3, and then the successful flight of Yuri Gagarin, the first man in space. But Korolev's own journey came to an end. In 1966, while undergoing a routine operation, he began to hemorrhage. The doctors attempted to intubate him. However, they discovered his jaw had been broken so badly in the gulag that the pipe could not pass into his throat. He died without regaining consciousness. He was only 59 years old. The space age continued to march onto the beat he had set almost a decade earlier, an age that landed humans on the moon and sent probes to distant planets, and an age that is once again starting.